Hey everyone, so there was some interesting Switch related news this week. Hardware experts Tech Insight updated their teardown of the new Nintendo console with the holy grail of hardware analysis, a die shot of the machine's apparently custom Tegra SoC system on chip. Only here's the thing, the configuration of the processor is actually, well, seemingly identical to a standard Tegra X1. And this is perhaps to be expected, bearing in mind that a teardown of the 2017 Android TV shows a processor built in the same time window as Switch's and looking pretty much the same. Now this still leaves a small possibility that the chip itself could have been a custom variant, but the die shot pretty much rules that out. So why is Nintendo saying it's custom when apparently it's not? Well, for its part, Nvidia said that their inputs amount to 500 man-years of effort across every facet of creating a new gaming platform. And yet it's an old chip, so what's the deal? Just how custom is the Switch hardware? Well, to be fair, Nvidia's blog post talks a lot more about just the hardware. Covers system design, system software, APIs, game engines, and peripherals. Maybe what they mean by a custom Tegra is adapting an existing chip to work as a dedicated console. And in that respect, clearly Switch is a significant achievement. So here's the new Tomb Raider 2013 port on Shield Android TV. It's a conversion carried out by Nvidia's own internal Lightspeed studios, and it's actually fairly decent, but it is rendering at 720p and it moves with a terrible jerkiness owing to a complete lack of frame pacing, something that is common on all Android OS 3D games. Now compare and contrast with Shinon Multimedia's Fast RMX on Switch, 720p with severely reduced GPU clock speeds, but it's 1080p when it's docked. It's like Switch is a completely different system based on completely different hardware. But there is the sense that we were promised more, and this leads us on to a story I'd like to share with you. Back when the Switch was officially announced and our Tegra story was validated, myself, Tom, and John sat down to record a videocast discussing the potential of the system. Nvidia said that the Switch chip was based on the same architecture as the world's top performing GeForce graphics cards. Well, at the time that was Pascal, and it still is, so by extension we thought that Switch was using a custom Tegra X2 variant, and yes, we spent a good portion of the videocast talking about that. One day later, while John is finishing up the edit, I learned from developer sources that Nintendo is still briefing game makers on an X1 spec. Now, in all good conscience, I couldn't put the videocast out, knowing that there was a strong chance that it was based on incorrect, albeit completely logical assumptions. So the videocast was mothballed until now. Since X1 is essentially all but confirmed, we thought you guys might get a kick out of seeing the videocast that never was, discussing a spec that never existed, a whole 6 months later. So yeah, enjoy that and thanks for watching. Hi everyone, I'm Richard, I run Digital Foundry, and today we are convening for another Digital Foundry videocast, and we're going to be talking about Nintendo Switch. And joining me here in the Digital Foundry office is Tom Morgan.
Hello, how's it going?
Not too bad. And over in Germany, in Frankfurt no less, we have John Linneman.
Good morning, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. How's it going?
Not too bad. John, so it's kind of like the weekend after the Switch reveal. What are you thinking about the system right now?
Well, I'm still pretty hyped for it, to be honest, after seeing it. We've seen some more, we thought more about the specs, and there's been some coming to terms with the performance we can expect from this, which we'll get to. But for a handheld / console machine, I still think the concept is quite interesting, and I think that Nvidia's graphics hardware or system on a chip there is actually going to be quite capable of delivering excellent results that Nintendo especially will be able to take great advantage of.
Tom, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm with John on this. It's just, we kind of let the dust settle after a weekend, and it feels like the right move for Nintendo. The big questions going into the weekend were about what the hardware was, what we were being shown, because it was a very short sort of teaser of what it was about, more the concept than actual the hardware specs or anything like that. So that was the more tantalizing aspect of it, which we're going to look into today, I think, isn't it?
Well, from my perspective, there were two things. First of all, it was very much about laying out the stall of what Nintendo and indeed Nvidia want to get out of this. Now, Nintendo, pretty straightforward. It was all about the concept, which we kind of discussed a few months ago when we reported on the leak. And yeah, it's basically a hybrid console that you can take anywhere, that you can also plug into your HD TV, which has detachable controllers, which is awesome. But perhaps more interesting from my perspective is what Nvidia are getting out of this. And that blog post they did was really interesting from my perspective, because it was kind of like, hey, games industry, this is what we're doing for Nintendo. We've done the hardware, we've done the APIs, we've done all of this cool stuff behind the scenes. It's like saying, we can actually do games consoles now. It's been a while, but we're back. This is what we're doing. And yeah, I mean, that's what I think they're doing. And it was really interesting, actually. Last week I spoke to Mark Cerny, the architect of the PS4, PS4 Pro. And from my perspective, up until that point, I was thinking that both Sony and Microsoft were locked into AMD pretty much going forward, that we would have systems that were based entirely on evolving AMD architecture. But what Mark said to me was basically PS4, PS4 Pro are of a generation. And the impression that I got is that they're perfectly happy to make a clean break for PS5. And so this is interesting, because now we have competing technologies in the console space, whereas previously AMD were dominant. And so that blog post from Nvidia was really striking for me, in that it kind of said, right, okay, so things are getting interesting now. So I don't know what you make about that, John.
Yeah, it's actually kind of fascinating. I first chuckled a little bit, because it feels like Nvidia's kind of been around the block now. I mean, they've had their time with Microsoft, they've had their time with Sony, and now they finally got their way with Nintendo. But it does actually kind of feel like perhaps they've realized some of the errors of their ways, and are trying to make amends by getting back and competitive in the console space once again. Though, of course, this project is kind of different from what we were seeing with the PS4 Pro and the PS4 and Xbox One in general. But, yeah.
Yeah, I think that fundamentally that, you know, Nvidia haven't got any shortage of technology that can compete against AMD in the console space. The only differentiating factor that AMD really has is x86 support, which is it's a pretty strong case for doing it.
And Nvidia have always sort of floated on the periphery in terms of producing stuff for the mobile side, you know, smartphones, which is fundamentally where we've seen these Tegra chips being used quite recently. There's a few other phones out there, and it's surprising to see how much of an omen the Shield was back in the day of what was to come, you know, from Nintendo. Who'd have thought that, you know, this device, the Nvidia Shield, would be the foundation, sort of a building block for what Nintendo would do?
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I mean, you know, fundamentally, if Nintendo wanted to go mobile, there really was no other choice in terms of power efficiency and experience in that field. And Tegra is a pretty obvious choice at that point. And that was always the thing. Previously, before the big kind of spoiler that we and Eurogamer did, I think it was in July, we kind of thought there would be two consoles. There would be a handheld and there would be a home console. Nintendo were pretty clear, like, I don't know, at least 2 years ago, that they kind of wanted to make the process of integrating mobile and home technologies a lot simpler, and that would have involved a common architecture. So it's kind of interesting that they've gone for the Nvidia route, and Tegra is where they've gone. And something that I do want to address is, obviously, when we did that story, or that Tegra would be in the NX, as it was known then, there was a lot of blowback, a lot of controversy about whether we were right or not. From my perspective, I actually learnt about this in April from a really solid source. I didn't run the story because I don't run stories on one source. And then typically across the month, we actually found out more about what the console was. And then there was some kind of big internal presentation at Nintendo of Europe where the information was spreading widely, and only then is that when we pressed the button on our story. So, you know, we only ran the story when we kind of were 100% certain that that was the way forward.
And it was at that point we could make some assertions about, well, what could it do? We did the piece on Nintendo Shield TV emulating these older games and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, and that was an interesting, I suppose it gave us perspective on what it could do with unofficial support of these older games.
That's interesting because it does open the door to Virtual Console. But one thing which was kind of like the thing which annoyed me about the reveal that we did was the one crucial piece of information we didn't have. Well, we knew that Tegra X1 was in the development kits, but it didn't really make sense to deploy that in a console that was coming out in March 2017 because, well, it was like 2 years old, over 2 years old.
And we still don't know for sure, do we? We know it could be, it could be X1, X2, or custom.
We know it's a custom chip because that's what Nvidia has said, and based on the latest GPUs, which means Pascal, which means a variant, I would say, on Tegra X2, which, if we look at the base specifications of that, now Nvidia were actually quite reticent to release the GPU spec of that. We only got that like a couple of months ago. And what we saw there is that, in actual fact, the amount of CUDA cores that the X2 has is actually identical to the X1. It may be why it is an X2 as opposed to a P1. 256 CUDA cores in there, just like the X1, but there are some interesting additions there. First of all, memory bandwidth. Got 128-bit bus now. X1 only had 64-bit, up to 50 gigabytes per second bandwidth, I think. So that is really, really interesting. So, but it also kind of ties in with some of the stories that we were hearing about the dev kit for the NX, as it was known at the time, which was that it had a really loud fan.
And a very short battery life as well.
Yeah, they were saying 3 hours. And one thing to bear in mind, I think, is that battery life on Nintendo portables, it's kind of degraded over the years. It's not like the Game Boy days.
For Nintendo, they made their mark on their handheld business with the Game Boy, which lasted, was it 8 hours?
It was over 10 hours potentially. And it may have evolved to that point, but yeah.
So that's where it won out over the Game Gear, and then 3DS has kind of diminished that since then. But it's surprising if it goes for about 3 to 4 hours.
The thing about that though is, do we know if the dev kits were actually just using an X1 chip in there?
That could change things substantially.
Well, it was using an X1.
So yeah, if it's using an X1, then some of the battery life concerns and rumors we've heard may have been actually based on that, right? Which we presume then the battery life would be significantly worse since the new Pascal chipset is so much more efficient.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the desktop space, the Titan X Maxwell and the GTX 1070, pretty much equivalent in terms of performance, but the 1070 is consuming 100 watts less. And that's not the TDP, the kind of theoretical maximum. That is what I measured in sort of actual gameplay usage, 100 watts less for the same performance, which is absolutely amazing. Yeah, so we could actually see improved battery life on the Switch, assuming that they have actually gone to 16 nanometer, which I'd say is probably almost certain. And yeah, interesting stuff really, but fundamentally it is still a mobile part, and a lot of people out there kind of wanted Xbox One, PS4 performance. We can categorically rule that out now, but there are a couple of interesting wrinkles there. I mean, typically Xbox One, PS4, they try to target 1080p, and I think, well, I'd say that the evidence strongly favours that the Switch is using like a 720p screen.
Yeah, and if that means, we can get higher graphical detail settings than we had on, say, the PS3 360 stuff.
Well, I don't think there's any kind of doubt whatsoever that the Switch is more capable than the Wii U. It's more capable than the Xbox 360 and the PS3, because we actually saw that with the X1, the Tegra X1. X2, more memory bandwidth, more memory, I suspect. The 128-bit bus can address up to 16 gigs of memory. I suspect we'd probably see something more like 4.
I think an important thing here as well, though, is what we've seen with the X1 already, is that it supports some of the more modern development tools. For instance, they've shown Tegra X1 running the Unreal Engine 4 Elemental demo wasn't perfectly smooth, but it was running quite well, which again, the Wii U has no support for Unreal Engine 4. It had very poor support for other older engines like Unreal Engine 3 and CryEngine. It just wasn't good for those types of multi-platform titles, but running on the Nvidia hardware now, I think we can assume that developers will have a much easier time actually designing and working with this system, even if it's not as strong as the other consoles.
Yeah, and I think actually Nintendo made a really strong point in the trailer when they showed the Skyrim remaster.
Yeah.
It was kind of them saying, hey, you know, there is going to be third-party support. It is going to be significant titles. And hey, look, this is Skyrim running on the Switch, and, you know, it doesn't look bad. Now, the question is, of course, you know, to what extent it will compare favorably with Xbox One, PS4, PC. But I kind of think that might be missing the point. Because fundamentally, I'm not going to be playing Skyrim on a PS4 on the train or on the plane.
Exactly.
And that is kind of the strength of the Switch, which is that you can take it anywhere.
Another thing about that is you have to consider then that this thing is going to contain multiple batteries when you're using it, right? Because you have to power the individual controllers, whether they're attached or not, plus the main unit itself. I mean, there's going to be a lot of action going on there, and I'm curious to see how that impacts things, the way that's set up, because it's pretty obvious that little dock that you put the two controllers in is going to charge each one, but then when you connect it to the unit itself, will that also charge those separately, pulling power off of them? Will it affect the battery life of the system if those are fully charged when you connect them, versus if they're somewhat drained and then you connect them and play? Those types of things are interesting to consider here when you're looking at it from a mobile perspective.
There are some interesting practicalities there. I think fundamentally you can't take that charging dock with you on the move, can you?
No.
So I would suspect that the unit probably does charge it. There might be like a kind of just a standalone AC charger for the unit, which would charge everything, possibly.
Yeah, for the most flexibility, you'd want everything to charge everything else.
Yeah.
And you feed through. Another part of the design that we looked at last time, just between me and John, was the screen. And there was an interesting revelation about that emerged on Twitter of all places.
I actually was talking about this before when I watched your guys' chat.
Yeah.
You were talking about OLED screens. It's like, guys, calm down. This is Nintendo.
Well, we were looking at it thinking, gosh, the viewing angles are good, aren't they? Yeah, wow, look at the contrast on that. I mean, and then it turns out that, you know, some very diligent person on Twitter zoomed in on one shot where the screen was clearly overlaid and it overlapped with someone's shoulder. And I was like, oh, that's a bit of Photoshop work there.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect the way they did it was to actually just, you know, absolutely rock solid tripod shots of the screen, map the overlay onto the display, and then add some kind of camera shake effect in post. I think that's pretty much what we were discussing the other day. And
it's common practice in adverts.
Yeah, I mean, they were kind of saying that it was representative of the gameplay experience. They didn't kind of say this is gameplay.
To be fair, they could direct capture and then just plant it on and just say, because you're not going to get dead on view, it's good just to get an idea.
But it does sort of leave the question of what technology the screen is.
So we're looking at Nintendo, right? We know they go for economical parts to sell their units without making a loss, typically.
Well, you say that. I mean, you know, you look at the gamepad here, and it is a sort of agricultural-looking design.
That might be
in many ways
the exception, though, I think.
Well, I don't think so. I think, you know, fundamentally, Nintendo is, at their roots, a toy company, and their core constituency is young kids. And so the hardware has got to be durable. It's got to be tough. And when you look at the gamepad here, it is durable. It is tough.
It is.
And it is economical. And one thing which I thought was quite interesting, I'm going to be really interested to see the Switch in person, because it actually looks like a much more higher end unit than obviously the gamepad or even the 3DS. Although looking at this one here, it's a pretty svelte unit there. But I don't know, maybe things have changed, because these days, you know, you go anywhere, you see 2-year-olds with iPads. And so, you know,
are they going to be carrying around the Switch?
Well, maybe not, but, you know, I do see it as being I don't really see Nintendo leaving behind their core constituency. I mean, when we were doing the official Nintendo magazine, the key demographic there was actually 7-year-olds. And I think that's probably moved on a bit because the brand has moved on. It's still relevant to even people my age. So yeah, but I wonder whether that is reflected in the hardware design as well.
Well, picking up the gamepad when was it 3 years ago? It's been a while now. I was very disappointed in the quality of that screen there. That was a TN panel, very low quality, and you can get a good range of, it's not set in stone how good a TN will be, but you can get the MacBook Air, for example, and that looked fantastic, really great pixel density, contrast, all that. And then there's this, it looks a little bit washed out. So Nintendo's usually erred towards TN panels, but we have seen them use IPS reportedly in their new 3DS XL models. Sort of one half of the batches are IPS, the other are TN.
But didn't they start with the IPS and then downgrade?
No, it's the TN first, and then it progressed to IPS. Yeah, so it's up in the air, but I really hope they're not resorting to... This is about the same size screen, I think, if deductions are correct from DualShockers.
Yeah, about 6.2 inch, which kind of ties in with the rumours that were going around.
Yeah, so same size screen, but massively reduced bezel. And I think, that creates the illusion, as we've seen with TVs, that it's a smaller screen, but it's roughly the same screen size. So it'll be interesting to see what technology they go for in the end.
So we obviously know then that the Tegra can support more modern things like higher resolution output like 1080p. I think the Shield actually can support HDR output, that sort of thing. I'm actually really curious to see how Nintendo balances this between the internal screen and what it outputs to the TV and which technologies they allow and which ones they don't take advantage of, because the headroom seems to be there, and it's really just, to me, it's kind of a question of how much are they really going to exploit what Nvidia has built.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, fundamentally, Tegra from X1 has 4K encode decode built in. I mean, it's probably the most advanced media block that they've got, and it's on par, better than anything AMD has too. And you're pairing it with a system which we strongly suspect has a 720p screen. So it's a kind of really interesting mismatch of technologies, and that may well be the case that in terms of the customization element of this particular Tegra chip, it may be the case, we don't particularly need this particular block, so ditch it. So, that may well be the case. But we'll just have to wait and see there. I think the big question we kind of need to address is what the dock is and what it actually does.
Right, so are you going to hedge your bets and say it's not going to enhance the graphical power, there's no actual extra extension, no GPU inside the dock?
There's a theory here, which is that when you're not reliant on battery power, when you're running from the mains, then obviously the capabilities of the chip fundamentally change, because you can run at higher clocks. You're not really concerned about battery life. And these are good things. It means, in theory, higher performance. And we actually have a real-life example of that. So the X1 was in the Shield Android TV, but it was also in Google's Pixel C tablet.
Oh, yeah.
So we actually have an example here of Nvidia technology being used, plugged into the mains, where there are no limits on power consumption, and where they've got a pretty decent thermal solution in place on the console itself. And we have what I assume is a passively cooled tablet running from battery. And I actually had a quick look at the benchmarks of the Pixel C versus the Android TV before we set up the filming here, and fundamentally there's not a lot in it. Anand Tech reckon it's running at 850 megahertz in the tablet and 1 gigahertz in the Shield Android TV. 150 megahertz differential. I mean, we're looking, I actually checked the benchmarks, 2 frames per second difference here. So it's not a big difference in that specific practical example that we have. So, I wouldn't get my hopes up there. And secondly, in terms of the actual design of the dock, doesn't seem to me to be particularly well designed for thermal dissipation.
Just the one vent at the top there, isn't
Yeah,
it?
you've got the one vent at the top, but from what I can see, the dock is kind of like a U-shaped arrangement, and the tablet sort of fits into it.
That's it.
So, if you were going to be doing a design that's all about venting heat as efficiently as possible, you would kind of want to increase the amount of surface area and vents available to get rid of the heat. And fundamentally, based on what I've seen, there's just those vents on the top. We don't even know if the tablet is actively cooled. We know the dev kits were. I'd say adding a fan to a tablet-style device, not ideal.
Yeah. I mean, this thing could... The dream is that it would plug into a TV and it switch to a 1080p native mode. I'm wondering if that's possible at all, given it's capable of a lot more if you raise the power input to it.
Well, there's a couple of potentials there. First of all, and I actually think this isn't going to happen, but in theory, Tegra can be matched with a discrete GPU. A discrete GPU could go in the dock, and then you would get your 1080p. Obviously, there are issues with SLI compatibility that we've seen on PC, but if your system is built from the ground up with native operating system support for that, who knows? But I just don't think it's viable for a number of reasons. It makes game development more complicated. Secondly, even memory bandwidth we can assume wouldn't scale if you increase the core clocks by having extra power. So you've still got that bottleneck there. And fundamentally, different engines scale differently with frequency. So that doesn't really work from my perspective, because not every game will be able to be run at consistently higher resolution. So in terms of what the dock's capable of, all I heard when we did the first story a couple of months ago is that it's got a couple of USB ports and an HDMI output, and lo and behold, the reveal last week, all it really showed us was a couple of USB ports and an HDMI output. I really want to be proved wrong here, because fundamentally I really like more power in my devices, and this ability to plug in to more power would be awesome. And actually, the issue that I have with the Switch is kind of, fundamentally we've got a system built for mobile, and it is a mobile device, but what happens when you plug it into the screen? Does the quality still work on a standard HD TV? And obviously, PS4, Xbox One, primarily built for 1080p or close to it gaming. And we can safely assume that the Switch isn't going to be in that level of fidelity, that level of power. So I'm kind of concerned, especially when there are rumours circulating now that the minimum spec for a Switch game is like 540p. We've seen what happens with that with the PlayStation Vita. Obviously, the Tegra is on a completely different level to that, and we should still get some excellent visuals, but it would still look, kind of grainy.
Yeah, we saw a lot on games like Uncharted, all the big
graphical
blockbusters.
They were actually much lower than 540p.
Oh yeah, no, but comparative to the Vita screen, that it always upscaled and it had a very sort of soft image.
Yeah, so that's kind of my concern there. So, but on the other hand, the Nintendo games especially, if they're built with 720p in mind and they have the quality that we've seen with some enhancements over the Wii U, I'm going to be pretty happy with that, because fundamentally I can take that game with me anywhere, and I think that is a major, major plus point, which obviously PS4, Xbox One, they just don't have.
It's true, and I think if you really sit back and look carefully, like take something like that Mario game that they showed, or the Zelda, that would, I think, become basically the best looking mobile experience you could get on the market today. I mean, seeing Mario running at 60 frames per second with visuals like that on a mobile platform, that's almost unprecedented, really, especially with that level of polish.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Nintendo just make games quite unlike anybody else, and I think that's a major plus point that they have. And I also think they're highly adept at making more out of the technology that's available. So, I've lost count of the amount of Wii U titles where, they just look absolutely fantastic, regardless of the fact that the core Radeon GPU in there is actually kind of ancient. It doesn't really matter. Nintendo sort of live in their own space, and I think that kind of will be another sort of facet of the Switch.
And crucially, as I said before, developers should be more familiar with this hardware and be able to take advantage of it in ways, that was one of the issues I think with the Wii U, is it just had some weaknesses and some some oddities that made it difficult to bring games to the system. So working with more familiar technology, if developers can bring games to the Switch in a more affordable fashion, I think that's a huge win for Nintendo.
Well, a while back I was speaking to a Wii U developer who developed a really big game, and the amount of issues that they had with the SDK, with the development kit, it was legion, and Nintendo weren't really set up at all for online gaming properly at that point. So I think, there's been a lot of learning that they've had over the Wii U generation where they can kind of port that into the Switch and do really well there. And secondly, the fact that a Western manufacturer is making the SDK, has done the APIs, and it's a technology that hopefully people will have some experience with, Pascal, Nvidia, Maxwell. It's not as if developers are completely unaware of those things. So, hopefully we should see people get more out of that technology. Personally, from my perspective, I'm really interested to see exactly what Tegra is capable of with a low-level API, with developers having direct access to the hardware. Because every time I've looked at a Shield device, there have been hints of brilliance. There have been sort of one title, two titles, three titles where you look at it, usually OpenGL stuff, which maps really nicely onto Android. And you think, wow, this is really, really impressive. The X1 version of Doom 3 BFG edition, for example, it is far superior to the last gen Xbox 360 PS3 versions. Trine 2, Frozen Byte, it's 1080p on Tegra X1 and 720p on Wii U, Xbox 360, etc., etc. And that's X1, and we're on what I would suspect would be some kind of customized X2 equivalent. I think there's a lot of optimism that we can have with the X2 technology, the Tegra technology that's in the Switch. And I think that the foundation building blocks are there, the APIs are there. Nintendo seems to be entrusting Nvidia completely with that, which I think is just excellent news.
One other part of this package, though, that a lot of fans of Nintendo might expect but might be disappointed is the backwards compatibility aspect of the console. Up until now, we've had ARM architecture, CPUs, and last 3DS we had a Pica GPU, I believe.
Yeah.
And it was a bit of an about turn. We didn't really see that GPU appear in many other devices. So.
Well, the Pica GPU was unique pretty much to the 3DS line.
And there's some rumors right now that it might appear in some fashion in the Switch, but I think that would just raise the costs of this device to a point where it just can't be sustainable for Nintendo to sell it on. But I'd love to see it, of course.
Well,
but it's
3DS compatibility in the Switch shouldn't be a problem at all, because the amount
through emulation.
Yeah,
you can do
exactly.
It.
Yeah, and that is, if we look at Nintendo's history there in terms of emulation, they've been pretty good, I think.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it the case that they can do the DS in emulation in part on 3DS? It's not an exact match in terms of hardware, so they kind of have to sync up the games in a different way.
I think that would have been fairly trivial, because there is commonality in the families. But in terms of the tests you did with the Tegra X1 on the Shield with an unofficial emulator.
Yeah, there's the Dolphin. It's a really people watching this already know about this thing. It's just one of the most ruggedly built emulators out there, and to think that an unofficial solution can play Wii games at 1080p, it's just incredible. And that's not even the target resolution of this thing, as far as we're aware. So that's I'm already off to a good start.
I actually think that Virtual Console on the Switch is going to be really impressive for exactly the reasons you mentioned. Fundamentally, this is kind of the strength of Nintendo in a way, that the previous platforms have all been based on actually sort of turn-of-the-century technology.
Yeah.
And, the fact that Nintendo has moved on to Nvidia Pascal, it's a huge leap. We can't underestimate that, and I think it only means good things for Virtual Console, so I'm really looking forward to that. Wii U, that might be a stretch too far, but it looks to me, based on those games that we were seeing in the trailer, Splatoon, Mario Kart, it kind of looks as though, the big winners from the prior generation, they're kind of porting over to the Switch and revitalizing?
Well, they can just port over the Wii U stuff, the big hits. Splatoon's one that we had rumored. I think we had Smash Brothers rumored as well, and a few others. But for anything before that, that emulates cleanly. And I think they've made the right choice and they've timed it at the right time technologically to make that clean break, if that's what they're doing here, because they can brute force their way to emulating all that stuff from Wii before. So yeah, I think people, Nintendo fans aren't going to be missing all those titles. It's gonna work out for the Switch, but.
So it's been an interesting discussion, but fundamentally we still don't know the exact specification of the Switch. Got some pretty good educated guesses, and obviously developers will have been using X1 for development up until fairly recently. There was a presentation, I think, in July, where it was still X1 in the dev kit. So yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm just really excited to see what they do. And particularly, I think, there's an interesting perspective on the way people actually kind of consume games these days. Do we need to be tethered to an HD TV to enjoy games? I really like the idea of being able to take a top quality Nintendo experience with me anywhere. It's kind of unique, in many ways. And just going to bed, screen right in front of you, going to work, quickly, take out the Switch, have a quick go there. And I also really like the fundamental principle of the shareability of it in terms of these controllers. The fact that you've got everything you need for multiplayer on the go, wherever you go.
I'd be interested to see the take-up of that feature, because there was a lot of demonstrations of the concepts, of the scenarios where people huddle around, play a basketball game after their actual game of basketball. And I'm thinking, I'm going to be cynical here and say that's maybe not going to be the part which people will really be drawn to when it comes to the Switch.
But again, think again of what I was talking about earlier about the older core constituency of Nintendo gamers, the kind of kids, being able to just, tuck the kids in the corner of a room with a Switch with 2 controllers. They'll be there for hours, tucked out of the way. I think it's actually going to be a really...
Maybe we're just too old to really see it from that perspective, but it is a big point. From my perspective, it is all about keeping it all to myself and having both those controls that's firmly attached to either side and going with it and then docking it when I'm back home.
Yeah, okay, so John, final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean... Again, as I said before, I think it looks like a solid concept. I can foresee myself using it, not just portably, but also when you go travel somewhere and you want to take a system with you, being able to bring the whole dock with you and easily connect it up to any display you want. It makes it kind of a nice sort of a dual system there, and I could see a lot of uses for that. And the hardware, I think it looks quite capable, and it looks nicely built, and I'm very eager to see more.
Me too. I think fundamentally, from my perspective, I'm just really happy to see something different. Kind of getting a bit bored of AMD consoles, because fundamentally they're all, it's not to say that they're bad consoles, but fundamentally they're answering the same question with the same technology.
Exactly.
And what I really like about the Switch is that we're seeing something new and different. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work, but I'm really looking forward to seeing. Okay, so we're going to leave it there for now. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. Hope it proved illuminating. This is kind of what we think about it right now. Obviously, we hope to see more from Nintendo soon, and when we do, we'll be commenting on it. But in the meantime, do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this particular video. Any ideas for individual video casts going forward, do let us know in the comments. Well, that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching.